When Sonja Falck was 26, she fell for a much older man named Colin before she even met him. It started when Sonja rented a room in Colin's house in London while he was away teaching English literature in the US. The first thing Sonja saw when she walked into his home was
books everywhere. Just walls lined with bookshelves. Poetry, novels, philosophy, psychoanalysis, sociology, linguistics.
You're beaming.
Just anthropology, health. And also what I noticed was nearly all the books that I owned, he had copies of as well.
Sonja had grown up in South Africa. Then, after getting her degree in psychology, she'd spent the last few years traveling and staying in hostels. She got the sense that Colin was a traveler too, from the art he collected. Sonja wanted to meet the man whose house she felt so at home in. And then, finally, it happened. One day, when Sonja and a friend were on their way out of the house,
we met Colin on the stairs. He had these really bright, quick eyes with his quick eye movements. And he was very energetic and springy on his feet. And after we walked away from each other, I said to my friend, I find that man so attractive.
Colin noticed Sonja too. And even though he was heading back to America, he came up with a way to stay in touch.
When we had spoken, I told him that I write poetry, and he'd invited me to send him my poems. And that was a big moment for me because I was very young and I'd never ever shown anybody my poems really. And he was this professor of English literature. He was a published poet. And he then said, I'm coming back from America. Would you like to have dinner? And then we can discuss your poems. And just before the dinner, he posted me this brown envelope returning my poems to me on which he had written comments.
This is like romance novel stuff. Okay, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, and that dinner happened on the 3rd of August. And we then named that date as our anniversary date. It was just obvious that both of us were just feeling really affected by each other.
What did he say about your poems?
He was really critical of my poems.
He ripped him to shreds.
Yeah, that was pretty devastating.
From the New York Times, I'm Anna Martin. This is Modern Love. When Colin ripped apart Sonja's poetry, it didn't turn her off. She liked his directness and his authenticity because that's the kind of person she was and the kind of person she wanted to be with. The connection between the two of them was so magnetic that when Sonja found out that Colin was 34 years older than her, it didn't stop the two of them from building a genuinely happy life together. Sonja and Colin never had a conventional love story. So when their age difference finally did start to pull them in different directions, they decided to write their own surprise ending, one that honored their history and prepared them for the future. So, Sonja, you knew that Colin was older than you when you started dating, but you didn't know how much older, right? Tell me about when you found out his age.
I was maybe 27 or 28. We went on a lot of day trips, and then we also went to visit all sorts of amazing literary places, like the home of the Bronte sisters in the Yorkshire Moors.
Oh my gosh, of course you did.
And there was a moment where I said to him, I think I should ask you how old you actually are. And he'd obviously been avoiding it and sort of acting like, you know, this is not something we really have to think about or talk about. When I asked him his age, he was over 60. And that did freak me out because I didn't know anybody who had anything like that sort of age gap. It's just beyond anything that's ordinary. Like, I just kept thinking, I wish he was at least under 60. Like, 60 is such a big number. Could he not just be even in his 50s or in his 40s.
Right.
And anybody who's ever met Colin, if they ever found out what his real age was, they were shocked. We went running together. He did not come across like a person in his 60s.
Mm-hmm. And your age difference didn't stop the two of you from falling so hard for each other. Can you tell me why not? Why did it not give you pause?
Because I guess neither of us were thinking in that kind of way. Like, how do you plan for the future and get your white picket fence and life insurance policy or things like that? We both had our heads in all sorts of different books and ideas, and that felt like what was real, and that's what we wanted to share with each other. And so that wasn't going to stop us. There was this moment where Colin and I were going to meet at the cinema. And as we were walking towards each other and I saw him, I just had this really strong feeling of, this is my person. I would follow this man to the ends of the earth.
Oh.
And I just did not want to think about the number. If you think about the number, then you have to think this can't work.
And your relationship continues to progress. You and Colin get married. You have 2 kids.
Yeah, we had these children, and we both had our interests, our intellectual interests, and he was writing. And when we became involved, he gave up his job in America so that he could come back to London and be with me full time. And this was the amazing thing about his age, actually, as a family, because he was home-based all the time. So I could be the professional woman, and I was really settling in as a psychotherapist, and he was my backup. He was a very hands-on father, and we bought this old camper van, and we would book ferries, like a ferry from England to Holland, and a ferry from Croatia to Italy, and a ferry from France back to England, and then we just drive, between those fixed points.
With your kids?
Yeah, with our kids.
Was there any friction with your age gap? Did having kids make you nervous about it?
No, it was the opposite. I think having kids really lulled me into just feeling this is life, and we are a family like all the other families, like the schools that the kids go to, and you meet all the other families at the school gates and all that sort of thing. You fit in with the mainstream in terms of like you raising kids in a neighborhood where there are lots of families raising kids, and you are coming together around all the children's activities, and you're having dinner parties, and it's cemented. We are a viable couple. We are a unit of 4, and the world accepts us. So that just made me stop worrying about it even more. There were a couple of occasions at the school gates where a new parent would refer to Colin as our child's grandfather.
Oof.
And it was always a bit embarrassing, and you kind of have to correct them. But we'd sort of take that in our stride.
I mean, it sounds like you didn't let other people's assumptions get to you. But something did start to change between you two as the kids got older, as Colin got older. Can you tell me about what that change was?
At this point, he was very close to 80. And I think this often happens with people as they get into much older age. It's almost like their childhood memories become more vivid than their more short-term memories. They become sort of really interested in processing their life and making sense of their life, and they're sort of looking backwards.
Interesting.
Whereas I was sort of really looking forwards. I was feeling confident. I was like really enjoying finding out more about the world and being active and meeting more people. So there started being these differences, like a sort of phase of life differences between us. We weren't being intimate anymore, and it was just clear that that was kind of over for him, and it just wasn't part of our relationship anymore.
What was that like for you, losing that physical part of your relationship?
It was a few years where I was kind of grappling with that, and And I did feel a bit weird. Like I felt, as a psychotherapist, I started feeling a bit like a fraud when clients were talking to me about their sex lives. And I'm starting to forget what this is about. It's like, it's like really becoming something that's not part of my life anymore. And I felt horrible about that.
Mm-hmm.
But I loved him so much and valued everything we had together so much. Everybody has to put up with something.
Yeah.
And I thought if a physical relationship is something we don't have anymore, then that's my sort of thing that I'm deprived of. We used to have that and we produced 2 amazing children. It wasn't an option to me that I was going to end this relationship.
Right.
And I just felt this is something that I have to accept.
Mm-hmm. But then there is this one moment where you're not able to ignore the fact that this physical component of your relationship with Colin has disappeared. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so an old school friend of mine had got into all these weird and wonderful things like reading tarot cards and
we always have one friend from school that gets into that, right?
Yeah. And she said to me, I've got this thing, I can sort of give you an assessment of your well-being and I can read your energy. So this sounded intriguing to me and completely incomprehensible. And I was like, sure, I'm up for it. Let's see. So like I was sitting down and she was sort of standing next to me and she started by hovering her hands over my head.
Mm-hmm.
And she said to me, wow, there's a lot going on there. Because I was sort of always intellectually very intense with lots of ideas and lots going on in my work. And then she moved her hands down, sort of around my chest. And she said, here is another really strong center of energy around your heart. And that represents your family and your friends. You're having a lot of fulfillment in that area of your life. And that's really strong. And then she kind of hovered her hands down. And then when she sort of got below my waist, she said, well, the energy's just stopped.
Was there something illuminating about her pointing this out quite directly to you?
Yeah, because it made it very obvious that there was something very unbalanced in my life. And I felt really, really sad. And I just felt like something in me is dead. So that was the first time that I was seeing that lack in terms of holistic well-being as a human being living a full life.
What did you do? How did you process that? Did you tell Colin about it?
No. I think, by that point already, there'd been a few conversations that hadn't gone well. And I just felt like that is where he's at. And that's not going to change by me saying to him, you know what, I'm really missing this part of life. He can't change that he's coming towards the end of the human lifespan.
Right. Of course not. And it seems like maybe both of you thought that was the end of the discussion. But not long after that, you decided to take a class. And something happened there that made it harder to accept what was missing from your marriage. Can you tell me about that class?
It was called How to Have Better Conversations, because my specialism is working with very high IQ adults who actually find it difficult to relate to others. And so I was really interested in, well, what are the mechanisms of conversation? So I arrived at this place and sat down, and quite soon afterwards, this man came up to me and said, oh, do you mind if I sit next to you? And I looked around and there are all these rows of empty chairs. There's loads of space. And he's saying, can I sit next to you? So he sat down next to me and I noticed he was very tall. My eyes just went sort of from the eyes to the shoulders to the hips. And it was...
You were liking what you were seeing.
Yeah. So he introduced himself, and his name's Richard. And he kind of immediately engaged me in conversation. And when the break happened for the class, we didn't even get up and sort of go and get anything to drink. So we just sort of got very sucked into talking a lot to each other.
What happened when the class ended? Did you exchange numbers?
Yeah, so the class ended, and at this point, Richard came up to me and he said, "Would you like to go for a drink?" And that was a really big moment for me, because it's not like we had a work project we were working on together. It's not like he was one of the parents of the other children that were friends with my children. It was like there was no connection that justified me going and having a drink with him other than I want to.
Right. So what did you say?
I said yes. And as we stepped out into the London street, which was the week before Christmas, and everything's all lit up, and I just had this feeling of I'm crossing a line that I never have crossed.
When we come back, what happens with Sonja and Richard and with Colin on the other side of that line? That's next. Okay, so Sonja, you just said yes to a drink with Richard, the cute guy you met in class. And then what happens?
At that drink, Richard said to me, "Let's do something that we were told in the class." And in the class, the presenter had said, for having better conversations, when you meet somebody new, don't ask them, "What do you do?" Because that just takes people along the track of repeating all your boring stories about what your job is. So Richard said to me, "How about we don't tell each other what we do?" And that was a lot of fun. Like, we didn't talk about those usual things you talk about that sort of define you as an employee or a parent or a spouse. You know, we just kind of didn't talk about who we were in relation to anything else. We were just talking about like who we were.
Right. Well, how old was Richard at the time?
39. He's a few years younger than me. And he was exactly 40 years younger than Colin. 40 years.
Okay, much closer to your age.
Yeah. At the end of the drink, there was this moment about like, are we exchanging numbers? And I just wrote just Sonja and my email address, because I didn't want to have phone calls with this stranger. But there was a feeling of like, I don't just want to never see him again.
Right.
And it started raining, and the rain smudged the words on the paper. And it was like, I don't know if he can still read my email address. But the next day, I received an email from him. And in it, he said he'd really enjoyed our conversation and he'd love to continue our experiment about how to have better conversations. Would I like to come to lunch? And I knew that I could not go. So I wrote to him and said, I got the feeling that maybe you're single, but I have to tell you, I'm not.
How did Richard react to that?
Well, he responded by saying, nothing in your circumstances would stop me from wanting to get to know you.
Wow. And how did that make you feel to read that?
Well, it was amazing. I mean, it's amazing in life meeting a human being who you feel interested in and drawn to, who feels the same way about you.
Totally. I mean, it's magic. So after that, you did see Richard again, but you tried to keep it platonic, right?
Yeah. What happened is Richard and I were getting to know each other a bit by email, and then we met up and we kissed. And so there was this big question about what is going on here and what do I do about this, or what does it mean for either of us? And then Richard had a very busy period of work and he kind of disappeared. I read that as, like, why would he want to carry on seeing a woman who's married with children?
Right.
Like, he actually can't do this. And I started confronting what this means for me. Like, what Richard stirred up in me. And like that kiss, it was the feeling of, I actually don't want to live anymore without this in my life. And that's when I went to Colin. By saying that to him, I got to the point where I felt I just have to tell him I can't do this anymore. But it wasn't about Richard. I didn't even mention Richard.
Right.
Because at that point, it wasn't about Richard. It was about me and my life as a woman and my marriage with Colin and what that marriage was denying me.
But that must have been such a difficult conversation to have with Colin. How did you feel bringing it up?
I've just felt terribly choked up and kind of guilty. It was really intense and awful. And it was fear or terror. Like, does this mean we have to name that this is over between us? And does that mean we break up?
Yeah. How did Colin react?
Well, he was completely amazing. We started talking about, well, what does a couple in our situation do? And we were like absolutely clear, there's no way we want to separate. We love each other. We want to both be there with our children daily, like not have them go between us. I wasn't going to be deceiving him and seeing somebody behind his back.
Right.
And then the other option was that Colin condones me finding a lover and that I do that discreetly so that it doesn't in any way affect the children or our life together. But that I am kind of released to experience that side of life again. And that was the option that we agreed on. And at that point, I was thinking, well, Richard's gone. Like, it's not going to be Richard.
He does return, though.
Well, what happened was, it was clear that there was something that really sparked between us in a very genuine way. And so I reached out to him and I said, you know, we haven't been in touch for a while, but could we maybe just meet up, even if it's for one last time? And then we met up and I then told him about what had happened with Colin. And he said he thought that was really brave of me to have talked with Colin. And then we got involved. So I had this office in Harley Street, and then that became the place where we would meet, you know, after everybody in the building was gone. And we saw many, many sunrises from my window in Harley Street. And we had this rule. So my youngest child would always, he had this little clock that shows the moon and stars at night. And it was set so that the little sun comes up at 6:30 in the morning. And at 6:30 in the morning, he would get up and run into my bedroom. And I said to Richard, I have to always be back in my bed at home because I never want my child to wake up and come and run in and I'm not there.
But it's so, I mean, it really speaks to the fact that even though you're building this new romance with Richard, you absolutely still have a full life, a family, a home, you know, a marriage with Colin.
Yeah.
Did you feel like you were living in a kind of split screen?
Yeah, I mean, it was really tricky because, of course, I felt really awkward about being with a different man. And then when I was with Richard, it was kind of, you know, he wasn't part of the family. It was so hard trying to keep those lives separate. I had lived with Colin and our children for so long. It felt really weird that I was building a relationship of a really important kind with a new human being, and they weren't meeting him. And Richard, even, there was a night where Richard said, well, Colin's been such an important part of your life. I would like to meet who that is.
So it's really clear that this relationship with Richard has become so much more than just sex, right?
Yeah.
But Colin doesn't even know about Richard at this point.
That's right. And there was this moment where, because Colin realized that I was staying out very late at night and arriving back at 6:29. And I said to him, do you kind of want to know what's happening? And then he said, well, in broad brushstrokes, okay. And so then I said to him, well, this person that I told you I'd met that night in the class, that's the person that I'm out with whenever I go out. You know, he's a really decent person. He's like a serious person. And then Colin said, that's a lot more threatening then. I suppose if he felt I'm falling in love with someone, would that actually be the thing that would be strong enough to pull me away?
Right. Because were you falling in love with Richard?
Absolutely.
How did you two move forward after that? It must have been really scary for you both.
Well, there was a point where Colin said, I think maybe we should meet. And I couldn't believe it when he said that. So we invited Richard to come to the house, and he was going to be introduced as a friend. And yeah, we just kind of hung out and made tea. And after we'd introduced each other and spent a bit of time together and all of that, I left with the children. I'd arranged it like this. So I would then take one of the children to their piano lesson, and the other one would come with me. And then Colin and Richard were alone at home. We were out for about 3 or 4 hours, and we came back to the house, and they were just really chatting, and they'd been there for hours.
Wow. So even though this meeting went way better than you could have ever imagined, there were still so many complex feelings involved, right? And that led to another incredibly difficult conversation with Colin. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. There was this day where I was with friends in the garden, sitting around the swimming pool, and we decided let's order a pizza. And I went into the house to ask Colin if he wanted a pizza. And I found that he was still in bed with the shutters closed in this darkened room. And I was like really shocked because he's always the first one to get up in the morning. And I said, what's wrong? And then he said, this is just all going so fast. And then I was just so upset. And I said, you know, this is awful. I can stop this. I will stop seeing him. And then Colin said, no, I don't want you to stop seeing him. I'm adjusting, and I am the past. Richard is the future.
Wow.
And after that, I saw that he was properly investing in wanting Richard to build a relationship with the children. For example, he was tutoring our younger son to do entrance exams for a school. And he said to me one day, is Richard coming today? Because I don't want to do a tutoring session if Richard's coming, because I want them to be able to spend time together.
Wow.
And I just couldn't believe the selflessness of him being able to see the whole in that way.
I mean, it's really incredible, and what a powerful and generous and deeply difficult thing to do, especially because, you know, we started this conversation by talking about how almost in denial he was about his age, but it feels like at this time, he's really facing that denial head on.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way, and this is what my mother said about it, she said that she felt me meeting Richard released Colin from having to try and be a partner to me at my age and stage of life. And then we agreed that we would divorce so that Richard could legally marry me, because Richard had asked me, he'd hypothetically proposed to me. He'd said, if you were free to marry me, would you want to marry me? And I had said yes. After we agreed that Richard and I would get married, he moved in. So Colin had his own separate bedroom, and Richard and I shared a bedroom, and the children had their bedrooms. And And we were like a family of 5 where we, that was our life. And we went on holidays together.
Did you go in the camper, the 5 of you in the camper?
We did, yeah.
And how many years did that sort of family of 5 continue for?
Until Colin's death in December 2020.
Oh.
So 4 years of Richard living with us before Colin passed away at the age of 86.
I'm so sorry, Sonja. What's life been like since Colin's passing? How are things with Richard?
Well, we are very happy together, and I love it that he knew and liked and respected Colin, and that we had lots of shared experiences with the children and Colin.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that continuity for the children. People kind of expect that there's going to be just conflict, or 2 men could never live together, or they could never accept each other, or that sort of thing. And those are the kind of natural human primitive impulses. But like the big key for me in all of this is the conversation. It's like we can talk about these things and face reality together. You don't usually have a succession plan in love, but why not?
Sonja, thank you so much for telling me the story of these 2 great loves of your life, the story of Colin and the story of Richard. I think our conversation today is a beautiful testament to Colin's memory. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. It's like very special to sort of process that together.
Modern Love is produced by Julia Botero, Christina Josa, Crystal Duhame, and Riva Goldberg. It's edited by our executive producer, Jen Poyant, with help from Riva Goldberg and Mark Pagan. This episode was mixed by Sophia Landman and Corey Schreppel. Our show is recorded by Maddie Masiello, and fact-checking is by Will Peischel. The Modern Love theme music is by Dan Powell. Original music by Marian Lozano, Dan Powell, and Carol Sabaro. Digital production by Mahima Jablani and Nell Galogli. The Modern Love column is edited by Daniel Jones. Mia Lee is the editor of Modern Love Projects. I'm Anna Martin. Thanks for listening.